The Cappadocian Fathers existed in a time of transition in Christianity. Basil of Caesarea, Gregory of Nyssa, and Gregory of Nazianzus had as much impact on Eastern Christianity as Augustine of Hippo had on Western Christianity. As such, they represent the leading Christian voices in the late 4th century on many issues. Now, of these three, Basil of Caesarea, also known as Basil the Great, is perhaps the foremost. One topic that has consistently been debated throughout Christian history is that of marriage. And Basil of Caesarea dealt with the topic of marriage in a manner mostly consistent with that of the other church fathers. This paper will first explore the standard patristic view on marriage, then the teachings of Basil on the matter will be examined, and this will be followed by a summary and commentary. Marriage and the church fathers. Before moving into what the church fathers understood about marriage, it is important to understand marriage in the early church's context. In contrast to Jewish and Roman circles, marriage was something was both something with both a sacred aspect and a secular aspect. This dichotomy played itself out in a separate dichotomy. Marriage was, on the one hand, a carnal relationship centered on sexual intercourse and procreation, and on the other hand, something essentially holy and sanctifying. This twofold aspect of marriage would be addressed by the church fathers. Now, in the Roman world, marriage itself was a private act that took place between free persons, even though it had major legal implications. Hunter goes on to note that a shift was underway in the secular understanding of marriage away from civic duty to an internal code influenced by Stoicism, which placed a new emphasis on marriage as a friendship. This new way of thinking about marriage would influence and be used by the Christian writers. The most influential of Christian writers was Augustine of Hippo. Writing in 401 in his work, The Good of Marriage, Augustine develops three goods: offspring, fidelity, and the sacramental bond. He goes on to argue that marriage itself is a true good, not merely the lesser of two evils. Even during Augustine's time, though, it is safe to say that no such notion of Christian marriage existed before the High Middle Ages. That is, that the marriage of Christians is somehow different from non-Christian marriage. Basil of Caesarea on marriage. Now, before Augustine would essentially settle the matter and lay the foundation for what the church would teach about marriage, the Cappadocian Fathers were addressing the matter each in his own distinctive way. Basil of Caesarea was born about 330, became bishop of Caesarea in 370, and died in 379. He is the most prominent of the Cappadocians and is perhaps best known for his role defending orthodoxy in the Arianism controversy and for being the greatest influence on Byzantine monasticism and playing some role later in Benedictine or Western monasticism. Even though his ascetic is often associated with monasticism, these ascetical writings, as well as his letters and homilies, are intended to convey that spirituality for the Christian is not merely for those who have taken vows and entered into the Cenobite life. The Christian life is to be centered on baptism, a life that is nourished by the sacraments. Basil does not write any text specifically on marriage, though he does address it in passing in his writings. Basil was possibly influenced by Eustathius, a cleric whose teachings were condemned at the Council of Gangres, though Eustathius's position seems to have moderated during the period when he influenced Basil. Eustathians were condemned for condemning marriage, disrupting the social order, and separating themselves from the normal Christian life. Holmes notes that Basil saw consecrated celibacy as a higher state than matrimony. Even though this is the case, Haney asserts that Basil never openly condemns marriage. The problem of marriage is that even though it is in some ways on par with celibacy, it requires much greater watchfulness due to more temptation. The key to understanding Basil's writings on marriage is to recognize that his expectation for the Christian life is one of absolute purity. In Homily 7, Basil writes on the matter of creatures that move about, creeping things. Within this homily, he draws an analogy between the unnatural union between a viper and a lamprey eel and adulterous relationships. First off, quoting Ephesians 5:25, that husbands are to love their wives, he reminds his readers that husbands and wives are united to live in the communion of wedlock. As such, they are not to be separated from one another, but rather reunited. For the wife, this means that no matter how bad her husband might be, he is still her husband, and that he is as a member of her body. For the man who plots an adulterous relationship, Basil compares him to the viper. He ends by reflecting that nature teaches mankind by example as to God's order of things. Now, continuing this theme, Basil in his homily 8 speaks of how the turtle dove should instruct women to remain unmarried after they are widowed. He writes, What veneration for widowhood, even in these creatures devoid of reason, how they prefer it to an unbecoming multiplicity of marriages. When it comes to second marriages, he also warns the fathers to learn from nature that such a marriage would make him forget his children from the first marriage. However, in his letter to Diodorus, Basil seems to endorse second marriage for one reason alone. It is a remedy against fornication, referencing 1 Corinthians 7:9, but that such marriages must be legal. In the case of widows, according to his second letter to Amphilochius concerning the canons, remarriage is not only allowed but encouraged according to 1 Corinthians 7:39. However, if she is over the age of 60, Basil recommends withholding communion from her because of her impure desire. In a letter to a fallen virgin, Basil brings up the death penalty for an adulterous man, with the implication being that how much more deserving of punishment for a man who has despoiled a bride of Christ. Capital punishment for adultery was part of Jewish law and was made part of Roman law with Constantine. In Basil's letter to Diodorus, he takes up the case of a man marrying his deceased wife's sister. First of all, he denounces unlawful intercourse as not being marriage. With that out of the way, he proceeds to examine the text from Leviticus 18:18, which was being used to support the marriage in question. He dismisses this as saying that Christians are no longer under the law as such, but must understand context of the various laws. For that, he points back to verse 6 of the same chapter that says a man should not have a sexual relationship with anyone who is related to him. Basil draws this out by stating, "For what can be more akin to a man than his own wife, or rather his own flesh? So through the wife, the sister is made akin to the husband." Now, perhaps his most extensive treatment of marriage is in his letters to Amphilochius concerning the canons. To begin, he answers questions on how to deal with cases of trigamy and polygamy. To support his argument, Basil references Jesus' encounter with a Samaritan woman who had 5 husbands in John 4:18. He interprets Jesus' words as not considering those who had exceeded the limits of a second marriage as worthy of the title of husband or wife. Such marriages are to be dealt with the man who engages in such being separated from the body of believers for a period of 3 years before being readmitted to communion. He closes his second letter by referring back to the issue of trigamy. He notes that it has nothing to do with secular law. It is not a matter to be dealt with publicly, but only within the church. It is better than unrestrained fornication. In the case of fornication and divorce, he references Matthew 5:18, the exception clause. Fornication is a legitimate legal reason for divorce. He in this section particularly addresses women. Fornication in general will be addressed below. According to custom, he argues that women should not divorce their husbands on account of adultery or divorce on the husband's part. However, if she does leave her husband, it seems to be implied for any other reason than fornication, and joins herself to another, she becomes an adulteress. If this is the case, the husband is considered pardonable, and if he remarries, the second wife is not to be condemned. If, however, it is the husband who leaves his wife and takes up with somebody else's wife, he becomes an adulterer by making the new wife commit adultery. In his second letter to Amphilochius, Basil discusses fornication and adultery more in depth. A husband commits fornication when he lays with an unmarried woman. If, however, the woman is married, he commits adultery. If he has committed fornication, the husband should be received back to his wife. However, the wife who engages in adultery is to be kicked out of her husband's house. Basil places the rationale for this, once again, on custom. For those who are engaged in fornication, which might be best understood as sexual activity outside of the marriage with an unmarried woman, or between an unmarried man and an unmarried woman, he writes this short paragraph. Fornication is not wedlock, nor yet the beginning of wedlock. Wherefore it is best, if possible, to put asunder those who are united in fornication. If they are set on cohabitation, let them admit the penalty of fornication. Let them be allowed to live together, lest a worse thing happen. Basil also addresses marriage within his ascetical work Morals, specifically Rule 73, where he deals with the relevant scriptural passages dealing with marriage. He first states that a man should not leave his wife, nor a wife or husband, except in the case of adultery, or if one is a hindrance to the other in the devout service of God, basing his argument on Matthew 5:31 and 32, Luke 14:26, Matthew 19:9, and 1 Corinthians 7, verses 10 and 11. Second, a husband shouldn't divorce his wife and then remarry, nor should she who had been divorced remarry, according to Matthew 19:9. Thirdly, husbands should love their wives as Christ loved the church, Ephesians 5:25, 26, and 28. Fourth, wives are to submit themselves to their husbands, Ephesians 5:22 through 24, Titus 2:4 through 5. Fifthly, women should not care for beauty, but rather good works. 1 Timothy 2, 9 through 10. Women should keep silent in church and zealous at home. 1 Corinthians 14, 34, 35. 1 Timothy 2, verses 11 through 15. Summary and comment. Basil writes further canons in regard to marriage relationships that dealing with slaves and dependents and among other specific situations. But what has been presented here covers the high points of the breadth and depth of Basil's teaching. When it comes to marriage, Basil's thoughts can be summarized into three categories. The first is natural examples. The second is adultery and fornication. And the third is discussions of divorce and remarriage. These three categories are intrinsically linked. On the first, in homilies 7, 8, and 9, Basil uses the examples of various animals to instruct his listeners' readers. These examples are both negative and positive. The mixing of the viper and the eel represents the unnatural. Just as such a mixing is unnatural, so sex outside the confines of marriage is unnatural. Just as a turtle dove does not seek a new mate, so believers should not seek out a new mate. The recognition of this similarity between biblical teaching and natural theology was not something that Basil alone recognized, but was developed by his fellow Cappadocians. Not only was such a link recognized, but it was utilized in an apologetic sense to engage the double standard of Greek culture regarding sexual morality. The second category deals with adultery and fornication. Fornication, as has been previously discussed, should be interpreted as any sexual activity outside the confines of marriage. For those who were unmarried, the act of sex was not to be seen as constituting the consummation of marriage outside of the strictures of society, in this case the church. Married men engaged in an extramarital affair with an unmarried woman were committing fornication. Adultery comes into view only in the case of a married woman's involvement, whether the man is married or not. The third category is the one with the most controversy surrounding it. When it comes to divorce, women are told that they should not divorce their husbands. Men are permitted to divorce their wives only in the case of adultery or abandonment, which leads to adultery. In these cases, they are not to be punished by the withholding of communion. The controversy comes in with regards to remarriage. For widows under the age of 60, remarriage seems to be encouraged. For widowers, a second marriage is not overly condemned, though some separation from the body of believers is to be carried out. Anything beyond a third marriage is not viewed as being legitimate. But what about after a divorce? There is some dispute over how to interpret Basil on this point. Hymes and Corden interpret Basil as allowing remarriage after divorce. They write, understanding porneia as adultery, he allowed the innocent spouse abandoned by the adulterer to divorce and remarry. In another case, Basil seemingly allowed the abandoner back into the community after a long period of penance without requiring the cessation of the second union and reconciliation with the spouse. Now, if Hymes and Corden are correct in their interpretation, then Basil stands at odds with the rest of the church fathers. They admit to such, especially in regard to Jerome's teaching that Matthew 5:32 refers to separation rather than divorce. In response, Ryan and Grisez wrote an article refuting this view. For their support, they quote Henri Couzel as saying that nowhere in Basil's writing does he allow a husband to get remarried as long as his former wife is still alive. This misinterpretation of Basil is due to a misreading of the required penance for remarriage being lighter than that for adultery. Conclusion. Basil, first and foremost, was concerned that those under his charge live their Christian lives in light of their baptism, that is, their identification with Christ. As such, their lives were to be pictures of purity and self-control. When it comes to marriage, Basil views it and celibacy on par with one another, though fraught with greater temptation. His writings reveal an openness to using natural theology as an aid to what has been revealed in Scripture. On matters of adultery and fornication, he is in agreement with the rest of the patristics. However, there is debate over how to interpret Basil regarding divorce and remarriage. One side has him siding with a much later Erasmian view. The other has him in line with the rest of his predecessors and contemporaries. Without further evidence in the form of more writings on this specific subject, it is unlikely that any definitive stance can be taken. The one thing that can be stated in this regard is that such actions were grounds for temporary, not permanent, removal from the community of believers.